Okay, in this next video lecture, we're going to be really diving into carbohydrates and introducing the four biological molecules. So this is really what it's all about. So we've been, talking about how to make large molecules through the processes of dehydration synthesis and how to break them down through hydrolysis. Okay, we've been using terms like monomer and polymer to describe these large molecules, right? So, what are the four major macromolecules? This term macro means large, right? And they are carbohydrates, which we're going to highlight here, proteins, which we'll discuss later, lipids, which we'll discuss later, and nucleic acids. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids in detail. Okay, so we get these macromolecules every time we eat food, and we break them down into their individual monomers that we then use for energy and for building up various structures in living things. Nucleic acids are large molecules like DNA and RNA, which we'll discuss later on in the year. But for now, we will focus on these three: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, which are also known as fats. So let's start by defining what a carbohydrate is. So you've probably seen carbohydrates or heard the term carbohydrates, right? And you know that they're associated with foods, right? We know that we get a lot of our carbohydrates from breads and pastas and things like that. And you may have, those of you that are athletes, may have the night before a big game or a swim meet or anything, been told to have a pasta dinner, right? You may have had a pasta dinner with your teammates. That's because you get a lot of those carbohydrates from it. And those carbohydrates can then be used the next day and burned for energy. So carbohydrates are large macromolecules that we get by eating these starchy foods, and they're a source of energy. So when you're going out for a run, you're initially going to start first. Your body's going to first go to these quick and easy carbohydrates to break down. As a molecule, carbohydrates, again, are polymers, and they're made up of individual sugar units, right? So they're made up of sugars. So carbohydrates is the polymer. The monomer that makes up carbohydrates is a sugar. Specifically, we're going to talk about the sugar glucose and why it's important. You can always recognize the molecular formula of a carbohydrate because it's always carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every carbon, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So for example, C6H12O6, which is the molecular formula for glucose, okay, that is in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So that's one chemical formula that you should commit to memory because we're going to see it over and over again. C6H12O6. This is glucose. Glucose contains 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. Notice that these are in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Specifically, right, we can call this sugar monomer in carbohydrates a monosaccharide. So the monomer sugar, this one single sugar molecule that makes up a carbohydrate, is known as a monosaccharide. So the monosaccharide is going to make up glucose. We're going to look at monosaccharides here in a second. Some carbohydrates are only made up of 2 sugars. So 2 sugars joined together make up a disaccharide. So again, there's that prefix mono, meaning 1. Disaccharide, meaning 2 sugars. Okay. When we have really complex carbohydrates, we're talking about polysaccharides. Poly, again, meaning many. Polysaccharide, many sugars. This prefix saccharide means sugar. So let's focus on one specific monosaccharide or one specific sugar monomer. So Monosaccharides, again, are just one single sugar molecule. The most important sugar molecule that I talked about is glucose. Okay? Glucose is going to be continuously, broken down in the body for energy. So energy is released and stored in the bonds of glucose. So um, just recall that the molecular formula C6H12O6 is glucose, and it is continuously stored in this bond, these bonds of glucose, lots and lots of energy, and that energy is in the form of ATP. Okay, and we'll talk about when we do cellular respiration how this glucose is transformed into ATP. But for now, just recognize that glucose is important in the production of ATP. Here's a little bit more of the molecular structure of glucose. Notice that it's got 6 carbons, and then the arrangement of the functional groups and the hydrogens around the glucose are what allow for its energy properties. Okay, so glucose by itself is a monosaccharide. Okay, it's a monosaccharide. And when we string together glucose with other simple sugars, we can make a large polysaccharide. If we string 2 together, we get a disaccharide, right? But they're all carbohydrates. Okay. So here's again monosaccharide. So we talked about glucose. Glucose is a monosaccharide. There's also fructose, which is another monosaccharide. And then galactose is a third monosaccharide. And all of these monosaccharides have the same molecular formula. So they are all C6H12O6. The difference is where the different carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens are arranged around this ring. So at every one of these points, there's a carbon. Okay. And those carbons are in different spots, and that's what makes the different types of sugar. Glucose, fructose, which is the glucose, very commonly in foods that we eat. Fructose is in fruits, and galactose is found in milk sugar. So we'll look at kind of how these are arranged in a second. Okay. So here we're just looking, and you would never need to memorize this. Obviously, it's a little bit complex, but we're just showing you how we join together different monosaccharides to make a disaccharide. So in this one, we're removing an OH and an H from a glucose to glucose molecules, and they're joining together to make a disaccharide. In this case, that disaccharide is called maltose. Here, we're doing dehydration synthesis, glucose and fructose together. So we're removing an OH and an H again, and we're joining these two together to make sucrose. Okay, so let's look at some examples of when we join together 2 monosaccharides. So remember, prefix di tells you 2. So in the case of a disaccharide, okay, we're joining 2 monosaccharides together. So we're either joining together glucose and glucose, we're joining together glucose and fructose, or we're joining together glucose and galactose. And that's how we get our disaccharides, which are a little bit more of a complex sugar than our monosaccharides. So to get sucrose, which is table sugar, through a dehydration synthesis reaction, we can join together glucose and fructose. Okay, and that's how we get sucrose, which is a disaccharide. Lactose, which I'm sure you've heard of, is milk sugar. We get by joining together one glucose monomer with a galactose monomer. Okay, glucose and galactose. So you can remember this one because it's got lactose right in it. Galactose. This is the only one that has lactose and galactose. Third disaccharide is maltose or malt sugar. which is glucose and glucose. And malt sugar is used in the production of beer and other malt beverages. So table sugar, sucrose, glucose and fructose together. Milk sugar, lactose. And some people are lactose intolerant. They lack the enzyme lactase, which breaks down lactose. And maltose, which again is used in the fermentation of beer. Okay, so these are your disaccharides. Two monosaccharides joined together. Okay, so here we're showing the dehydration synthesis reaction of glucose with glucose, right? So recall two glucose molecules together give you maltose. Water is removed and these are joined together to give you maltose. Okay, so we've got our monosaccharides, glucose, galactose, and fructose. We've got our disaccharides. We've got sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. We've got lactose, which is glucose and galactose. And we've got maltose, which is glucose and glucose. Now we've got polysaccharides, which again, remember, poly means many. Saccharide means sugar. So here we've got many sugar molecules, many glucoses linked together to give us a polysaccharide. You may have heard of polysaccharides, also called complex carbohydrates. Okay? And we find these complex carbohydrates in both plants and animals. Polysaccharides are chains of simple sugars, usually glucose. Okay, so long chains of sugars. Polysaccharides act as storage molecules for energy. Okay, so these guys are going to store energy for long periods of time, kind of similarly to what we're going to see with fat later on. We can break down polysaccharides from storage to get the energy from them, right? And our human body stores polysaccharides in the form of glycogen, we're going to see, in our liver. Polysaccharides can also act as structural compounds, so they can make up sort of the exoskeletons of insects, we're going to see. Starch is an example of a plant-based polysaccharide. Lots of foods that contain these starches are, things that you would expect to. Roots like potatoes, rice, bread, cereals, right? Really starchy, carbohydrate-rich foods. We can see these long chains of glucose here in the potato cells, which is a very starchy root. Okay, so these are the examples of polysaccharides that you need to recognize. Polysaccharides, many sugars. The first one is starch. Starch is a polysaccharide, and it's used by plants for energy storage. Okay, so plants have starch as their energy storage, and we can break down that starch over time and get the energy out of it when we eat foods that are rich in starch. Animals use glycogen for energy storage, right? When we eat foods that are very high in glycogen, we get the energy from it. And our body also stores carbohydrates in the form of glycogen in our liver, which we can then break down and use for energy for running and jumping and all things that we do that require the glycogen. Cellulose is you may remember from when we discussed cell parts, foreign plant cell walls are made up of cellulose. Okay? And cellulose is something that when we eat foods that contain that, we don't really break it down. It ends up being excreted as waste. Chitin, okay, is another example of a polysaccharide. It is found in insects, spiders, and crabs, and it makes up the outer exoskeleton, outer covering, right? So you want to recognize these four polysaccharides. There's more, many more. There's also oligosaccharides, which you'll see we might do, talk a little bit about in class, but which are very large polysaccharides. But these are the four I want you to recognize and what they do. So here's just kind of a look at, we see starches, we see chitin in insects and crabs, Okay, you can see that if you were to break down kind of the cell walls and get them down to their bare molecules, they're made up of these cellulose repeating molecules, right? Starch made up of glucose molecules as well. All right, so this ends the video lecture on carbohydrates, and next we will discuss lipids.